Hi everyone, thanks for joining. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about all things micromobility parking. These are this is my contents of what my presentation will contain. So I'm going to begin by giving an overview of the Future Transport Zone program and how micromobility fits into that, and then an overview of our micromobility scheme. After that, I'll look at our approach to parking, our parking expansion strategy, our Solent Equalities Forum, and sort of how that fits into our strategy as well. And then at the end, I'll look specifically at our approach and how we've delivered footway parking and then carriageway parking. So if you've already attended one of these FTZ webinars this week or last week, you may have already seen this slide, but this sets out all of the FTZ projects within the program. So today we're specifically looking at Theme 1 personal mobility, and within that I'm responsible for overseeing our e-scooter project and our bike share project. Although as time has gone on, these have kind of morphed and merged, and effectively we now manage these two projects as one wider micromobility project. And yeah, so here's an overview of that micromobility project. So we have three schemes which are fully funded and centrally managed by the Solent Future Transport Zone. They're currently operated by Voy across Southampton, Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. And that map on the right there shows the service areas, and each of those individual pins represents a parking bay. We used to have a dual operator system where we had one operator doing bikes and the other operator doing scooters. But in 2024, we ran a procurement to transition towards a sole operator model, with the primary focus of enabling the scheme to reach commercial sustainability so it can live on long time into the future beyond the end of the FTZ program, which ends in a couple of months. And so, yeah, the outcome of that sole operator procurement led to Voy being chosen as the sole operator in July 2024. That's when they launched as a sole operator. So they now deliver scooters and bikes across the three areas, and possibly will be expanding into Hampshire next year as well. So currently Voy has over 2,000 vehicles in operation. That's around 1,600 scooters, 600 bikes, and those are in operation across over 600 bays across the three areas. To date, we have generated over 5 million micromobility rides across the Solent scheme since the first scheme launched in November 2020. And from those 5 million rides, we see that 1 in every 3 rides replaces a private car or taxi journey, which is really good to see because, that's kind of what these schemes are all about, enabling a sustainable alternative mode of transport which reduces congestion, improves local air quality. So why is micromobility parking important? You might think, micromobility parking is just one aspect of delivering a micromobility scheme, but it probably is one of, if not the most important thing. And ensuring that you get the parking model right and then you get the right level of parking density are the two factors that basically make the scheme as good as it can be for the user in terms of having a good user experience, but also making it as good as it can be for non-users. So for the local residents that are living in the city that might not use the scheme. And that's because, you can have a whole different range of models of parking. You can go from a free floating model where people can leave their bikes or scooters wherever they like. That's great for a user because they get ultimate flexibility, but it's not so good for a non-user because you're likely to see scooters and bikes kind of left anywhere and everywhere. And right down at the other end of the spectrum, there's like a whole range of different approaches, but right down at the other end of the spectrum, you have like a fully physical dock scheme, such as the Santander Cycle scheme in London, where you have to end your ride in a physical dock, and you have to lock the bike into the dock. If you get to a dock and all of the physical spaces are taken, then you have to go and find another dock. And I'll kind of get into more detail of our approach, but yeah, we've kind of fallen somewhere in the middle, probably a bit closer to the fully physical dock side of things, and we've chosen that approach because it's good for non-users, and that leads to reduced negative feedback from the public, but also it provides a really good user experience. And that ultimately, getting parking right is the thing that drives drives ridership. And to date, we experience over 95% parking compliance, so over 95% of all rides end within a bay, and that's well above the UK average. It's also worth noting that micromobility parking is really useful and important for brand awareness. So we carried out some e-scooter polling a couple of years ago, and we found that 80% of people in the Solent area find out about micromobility from seeing it on the street. So either seeing a scooter or a bike going past, or the Voy logo on a parking bay. And for the operator, yeah, that's kind of how they market their scheme. They don't really invest in marketing through other forms, so they really focus on people seeing the scooters and bikes and bays on the street and word of mouth. So yeah, our approach to parking, we have kind of ended up, so we have three schemes, as I mentioned, and we've kind of ended up with a slightly different approach in each area. So in Portsmouth, there is a hard requirement for every bay to have physical parking infrastructure, and the majority of the bays are on the Footway, although there's a couple on the Carriageway, and there's going to be more on the Carriageway in the future. Whereas on the Isle of Wight, they focused for all of the parking bays are either painted or virtual bays, and they're all on the Footway. Whereas Southampton has kind of gone for a mixture approach where it's mostly physical infrastructure, but there's also some painted bays and virtual bays, and there's quite a lot of carriageway bays, but at the moment, most bays are still Footway bays. And the reason that we've ended up with different approaches in each area is because the three areas have varying characteristics in terms of demographics, geographical constraints, political environments, and all of those things mean that, yeah, a slightly different approach to parking was desired. So, for example, in Portsmouth, it's a really dense city. The streets are really narrow. It's really densely populated. And therefore, having a really tidy scheme was like the number one priority. And as a result, there's, yeah, a hard requirement that all parking bays are physical infrastructure, as we know, both kind of from other schemes and our own scheme, that painted bays and virtual bays, which the Isle of Wight have chosen, offer more flexibility for being able to install bays quickly. It's easy for the operator, but physical infrastructure encourages tidier parking. So I'm now going to go through a few examples of the different kinds of infrastructure that are used. So here we have two examples of Voy's parking racks. On the left is that's what they call their parking rack that can either operate as a single-sided rack with 5 physical spaces or a double-sided rack with 10 spaces. So it's great. It can be put up against a wall and act as single-sided. It can be put in the middle of a big footway like here and be double-sided and have more space. And then for busier, larger areas with more space, they use what they call their Type 3 bay, which can be seen on the right there. And that has 12 physical spaces with like an overflow area. So one of the reasons that we really like Voy as an operator is that they have this thing called a max cap. So basically all of their parking racks will have a physical number of spaces. So this one on the left has, if it was single-sided, it would have five physical parking spaces, but Voy kind of has an overflow called the max cap, and that allows, at peak times people can park their vehicle there even when it's physically full. So for a rack that has like 5 physical spaces, the max cap might be anything from 7 to 10. And yeah, it means that if it just kind of allows for those busier periods and it provides a better user experience. But then when it reaches the max cap, Voy's operational team will receive a message in their management app saying to go and visit that location, and they'll visit and redistribute vehicles away from it. We also have these docking stations, and these are kind of left over from the Beryl scheme, which was the bike share operator. So and there were about 100 of these in each of Southampton and Portsmouth. So when Voy became sole operator, they took over all of Beryl's parking infrastructure, which was great for them as an operator. Like overnight, the number of parking bays they had increased by like between 30 and 50%. And the other good thing is that, although these docks were like designed for Beryl's bike, they're what Beryl called a dumb dock. So there's no electricity that goes to them. As with all of our parking infrastructure, the bike kind of just neatly sits within it. It's not fixed to it. And that meant that fortunately, Voy's bike and its scooter also kind of fits quite nicely into it, and they were able to easily take over all of Barrel's infrastructure. We also have painted bays, which I mentioned earlier on the Isle of Wight. All the bays are painted or virtual bays, and these offer more flexibility. They can be installed more quickly. These are some examples of virtual bays, which can be installed even more quickly. They're kind of, you can only tell they're there if you see a collection of scooters or bikes, or if you're in the Rider app and you see a pin at the location of the parking bay. So again, it's great for being able to install really quickly, but for like non-users, it's not the best, because they might not be in the Rider app and they just see a collection of scooters and bikes, and it kind of looks like, have those scooters or bikes just been abandoned there? It can be a bit confusing. So we generally aim to not have so many virtual bays, but there are a couple in Southampton, and at the moment the Isle of Wight has quite a few. They're in the process though of going through a process of relining all of these so that they become painted bays. We have two types of carriageway bay. So this is a more new thing. So this is a painted bay with a bollard on either side in the carriageway, and this is good for quieter locations. It's cheaper than the other infrastructure type for carriageway parking that I'm going to show in a minute. And so the one on the picture on the right is in Southampton. The picture on the left is in Portsmouth, because I said before, Portsmouth has like a hard requirement of physical infrastructure. For their painted bays, they still require a rack to be inside of it. And then this is the other carriageway option, which is a painted bay with a parking corral. So this is a slightly more expensive option, but it's really good for busier locations. It's much more visible, and unlike the bollard option, because there's that physical infrastructure, it encourages tidier parking. And yeah, these are in place in, picture on the left is Portsmouth, picture on the right is Southampton. One final benefit of them is that they can be oriented with the opening either facing the footway or the carriageway, depending on the location. So this location on the left has like a really small dropped curb and a really wide pavement, so it's really easy for users to get in and out of the bay. And then this is New Road in Portsmouth, which is quite busy, so it was chosen for the opening to be facing the footway. Whereas this example on the right, I think, is Priory Road in Southampton, which is like quite a quiet residential street with a big curb and a narrow footway. So it was decided that, it's better for the opening to face the road so that users can get in and out. And then also, if for carriageway parking, if users are starting their ride in the carriageway, they're less likely to ride on the pavement, because these bikes and scooters are designed to be used on the road, not on the footway. So now I'm going to go through our parking expansion strategy. And this has been something that we've developed over the last few years, and it sets out our plan for parking and expanding parking over the next 5 to 10 years. We got input from Voy on this, on what they believe the optimum sort of parking density should be. And to be honest, Voy bang on to us all the time about how important parking density is. They say that parking density is like the biggest driver of growth in rides, because it makes the scheme a lot better from a user experience perspective. And as you can see from the right there, Voy finds that 90% of users are willing to walk 2 minutes to find a vehicle, whereas only 50% are willing to walk 5 minutes. And Voy recommended to us they thought the target for parking density should be, for acceptable levels, they recommended 25 bays per kilometre squared, which is a 2-minute walk between bays. And then for optimum levels, they recommended 40 bays per kilometre squared, which is a 1.1-minute walk between bays. So we took that on board and sort of analysed it, and we used their guidance to create a more realistic but still ambitious target. So we have a target of acceptable levels would be 15 bays per kilometre squared, which is a 3 to 4 minute walk between bays on average, whereas optimal levels would be 25 bays per kilometre squared, which would be a 2-minute walk between bays. And this next slide will show kind of where we're at and where we're aiming to get to. And this is focusing just on Portsmouth and Southampton. So current levels are, we have 6.9 bays per kilometre squared. So on average across the two cities at the moment, you have to walk around 6 to 8 minutes distance between bays. And we currently have 509 bays in the two cities. So if we're to get to acceptable levels, which is 15 bays per kilometre squared, we basically need to double the number of bays to get to 1,110. And then if we're to reach optimal levels, we'll need to increase it again to 1,850. So we've done, our scheme's been in place for 4 years. We've done a lot of expansion, but there's a long way to go. And the bottom part of that table provides a useful comparison against other schemes. So the DfT recently shared some data on parking density and various other things of all the UK schemes. And these are the sort of the three top locations in terms of parking density and number of bays. So Newcastle has quite a high parking density, 11.5 bays per kilometre squared, but it only has 278 bays. So it's kind of like a city centre focused scheme rather than the whole city. And then on the flip side, Bristol has loads of bays, but their scheme covers a really large area. And then finally, Liverpool has 20.3 bays per kilometre squared, but they have 1,500 bays. And all of their bays are virtual bays. So kind of what we're aiming at is to get to the point that Liverpool is at, but I would say we've probably got a more responsible and cautious approach to parking, where we use physical infrastructure and we have quite a rigorous approval process for parking consultations to ensure that we're consulting with the public, only installing parking bays at appropriate locations that meet the requirements of our risk assessment checklist. And that's quite a long process to go through that whole approval. So as a result, this is why this is our long-term vision for bay expansion. And our aim is to incrementally increase bays over the next 5 to 10 years to reach the optimum target. So on the Isle of Wight, it's a slightly different story. The Isle of Wight scheme doesn't cover the whole island. It's limited to 4 towns: Cowes, East Cowes, Newport and Ryde. And it has a slightly different challenge in that it has a larger geographical area than the cities, but a sparser population and not as much resource to develop the scheme. So currently, the parking density on the island there's 95 bays, and that constitutes 2.6 bays per kilometre squared. And we have an action plan in place, which we work on with Isle of Wight Council and Voy to help develop the scheme. And that aims for next summer to increase the number of bays to 150, which would enable 4.1 bays per kilometre squared, which we think if we can reach that target, we'll see a significant increase in ridership. So far, it sounds like all I've been talking about is parking bays, and it seems like, that's the only driver of growth and the only thing we need to worry about. But it's also important to consider the fleet size that you have. So there's no point increasing the number of bays if you don't have the fleet to match it. And you want to avoid a scenario where you have too many bays and not enough fleet, not enough scooters and bikes, and you end up with empty docks like you can see on the left there. But you also want to avoid a scenario where you have too many bikes or scooters for the spaces you have available, and you results in overcrowding. Voy recommends, what it's aiming for is basically as an average across the city for all bays to be about a third full at all times. And that means that a user they get to a bay and they have enough choice to be able to pick a vehicle, but then also when a user is ending their ride at a bay, there's going to be a space available for them, and the bay is not going to be overcrowded and is more likely to be tidy. So, obviously you're always going to get hotspots and more popular areas in the city, but as an average across the city, that's kind of what we're aiming for. And also, so far from my presentation, you might get the idea that, all we care about is rapid growth, or I have explained that we're trying to do it cautiously and responsibly through proper consultation methods. But another thing that influences our strategy is the Solent Micromobility Equalities Forum. So this was developed at the start of our bike share scheme in 2022. And it kind of provides local equalities groups with a platform and a voice to be able to share concerns about the schemes. So typically we have the kind of groups on the schemes on the forum are mostly visual impairment charities. And we also have the equality and diversity leads from the local universities, and also a few other charities. And at the other side, it gives Voy the opportunity to demonstrate what they're doing to reduce negative impacts on those groups, and also what they're doing to help improve the accessibility of the scheme. So one thing, for example, that Voy shared with the group early on is the fact that if you see this photo in the middle, there's a yellow circle around that side plate on the rack, and that's what Voy it's called the RNIB side plate. So they developed that with the Royal National Institute for the Blind, and the aim of that is that it makes the rack more visible. and it's like becomes less of a trip hazard. For people with visual impairments who still have some sight, it means that the rack is more visible and they're less likely to trip over a scooter that's poking out. We've The forums also led to Solent Transport, the local authorities, and the operator visiting some local visual impairment charities. So that photo on the right there is we visited Southampton site a couple of years ago. We've also this year visited Portsmouth Visual Impairment Action Group on a couple of occasions, and that gave us the opportunity to meet people with visual impairments and understand how the scheme and negative aspects of the scheme can make their daily life harder. We tried on some special glasses, which kind of simulates what it's like to have a visual impairment. So I think that photo on the left is what it's like to have glaucoma. So you have some sight, but yeah, some areas are blurry, and in that photo there's a scooter on the ground, and it kind of shows how it can make life more challenging if you have an untidy scheme for certain groups. And so that is directly fed into our planning of new bays. So we have a risk assessment checklist, which I'm going to go into in more details later. But yeah, ensuring things like all bays meet a minimum footway clearance requirement of 1.8 meters means there's enough space for people to walk past easily, people with wheelchairs, people with buggies, etc. And also to ensure that voice rebalancing efforts are ensuring that bays aren't getting full, and their end of ride photo and end of ride process is good enough that ensures that people that do park badly are penalised. So last two sections just focus on footway parking and then carriageway parking. So for footway parking, we use the approval process called the S115 tables and chairs license. That is basically the same license that pubs and restaurants use to get approval to put tables and chairs out on the footway. And when the e-scooter trial first launched, there was basically no formal government-led approval process for micromobility parking on the footway, and there still isn't today. And we were advised by the Southampton and Portsmouth legal departments to use the S115 process. They said that was the most appropriate process to use, that was kind of the most robust and responsible. So that's the process we use. It's quite an extensive process. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but as you can see, there's a whole pre-consultation phase. Then there's a 28-day consultation, and then that gives residents the opportunity to provide responses on the proposals. And then at the end of the consultation, we review the objections and draft a set of recommendations. And at this stage, where possible, for like new areas starting a micromobility scheme, I'd recommend, where you can, try and absorb negativity that's not based on evidence. And it's important to prepare key stakeholders for an inevitable backlash at the start of a scheme, but reassure them that this will ease over time. And that's really what we've seen, that as the scheme's gone on, the number of objections we receive per consultation has reduced. And also we've been able to put together some set responses to certain kinds of objections that we receive a lot that aren't based on evidence. So for example, there's two that come to mind. One is people often object to a bay going in because they're worried about antisocial behaviour, but we found there's no correlation between micromobility parking and antisocial behaviour in the Solent or elsewhere. So we have a standard response to overcome that kind of objection. And another objection that people give is that they say, why do we need a bay here? There's already one around the corner. And then we go and check on Google Maps, and that bay around the corner is actually a 6-minute walk away. And when we're aiming to get to a point where all the bays are 3-minute walking distance away from each other, that means that, actually it might be a 6-minute walk away, but we still need a bay here to meet our parking expansion target. And so, again, we have like a prepared response for that kind of objection. But there's challenges and successes with the process that we use. So as I said, as you could see from the list, it's quite a detailed process, and it does take quite a long time to complete a consultation, around three months from start to finish. And there's one major limitation of the S115 process, which is that the frontager gets veto power. So within the S115 process, you can have the best parking site in the world, but if you're proposing to install it and the person whose property it is next to objects, they get the power to completely object it and prevent it from going ahead. And I guess the frustrating thing there is that you only find that out once the consultation's concluded. So you go through around like 2 months of work just to find out that there was a frontage objection and the site can't proceed. And we find that a third of all footway sites receive a frontage objection. So it is really limiting because a lot of resource goes into proposing and shortlisting those sites and carrying out the consultation, and then a third can't go ahead. And then on the flip side of those sites that don't get a frontage objection, 86% are approved. So it really shows that I think we've got the process down pretty well, and we're selecting really high quality sites that meet all of the criteria. Um, but yeah, the frontage objection is quite limiting. So to kind of overcome that and improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the process, we've developed two things. One is a risk assessment checklist, which I've mentioned a couple of times already. That was something we developed a couple of years ago. And before that, local authority officers were carrying out like full-scale risk assessments for every site, which was time-consuming and resource-consuming. So we flipped it so that Voy now there is like a 15-point checklist that they have to go through for every site. And yeah, it reduces the burden on the local authority and it's more efficient, but also it leads to Voy recommending better quality sites because, before they might just try and propose as many sites as possible, but loads of them might not meet the criteria. But now they can see themselves what the criteria is and it has to meet it, and they don't bother proposing a site if it doesn't. So that's been really useful. We also have the parking log, which is like a massive spreadsheet containing all the data on all the live bays, all the bays that have been proposed and rejected in the past. And that means that, again, like Voy are less likely to propose a site that has already been proposed. And we're now at the point with footway parking where like we're running out of places that haven't already been proposed. We've basically almost covered the whole city. And yeah, these two factors then, the risk assessment checklist and the parking log, have helped to lead to double the number of sites proposed by Voy being approved for consultation. So now I'm going to move on to carriageway parking, which is the final section. And just to provide the context, like what is carriageway parking? Why are we looking at it? So yeah, it's micromobility parking on the street, in the road, not on the pavement. And until 2023, in the Solent, all parking was on the footway, and that's pretty typical across the UK. But we wanted to consider carriageway parking for the following reasons on the screen there. It takes space away from cars instead of people. It declutters the footway. It reduces conflict between micromobility users and pedestrians. And it's also supported by local and national visual impairment groups. So both groups on the Local Equalities Forum support carriageway parking, and also groups nationally. So I think Guide Dogs and RNIB both have like position statements advocating for carriageway parking over footway parking for micromobility. It also discourages pavement riding. And then also critically, it helps to increase parking density. So like on that last slide, I said we're basically running out of footway that we haven't already considered. But we've still, we're only halfway towards reaching the parking density acceptable level target. And there's so much untapped potential in the carriageway that it's basically critical for future expansion of the scheme in Southampton and Portsmouth particularly. We'll kind of focus on carriageway parking. So it's a slightly different approval process. It's a traffic regulation order, or TRO, and that, unlike the S115, that's a three-week consultation. However, despite that, even though it's a 1 week less, it's still quite a lengthy process. We still follow most of the rest of the process. So we're still basically looking at about 3 months at least from start to finish. It's slightly more expensive per parking bay. It also has political challenges, and there's been some instances of negative press. But despite that, we've installed 26 carriageway bays across Southampton and Portsmouth. We've got a really high consultation success rate. So 80% of the sites that go to consultation are approved. And the key distinction that has helped that compared to footway parking is that the TRO doesn't have that frontage of veto power that footway parking does with the S115. And so that's enabled us to have a higher success rate. Of the bays installed, it's a high parking compliance, positive feedback from the Equalities Forum, and we're now considering 50 more sites, which are under consultation in Southampton and due to go to consultation soon in Portsmouth. So this is my last slide, I think. So what are our learnings from carriageway parking? Yeah, it was quite a careful process that we went through. We sort of started by reviewing existing examples from the UK and Bergen and other places in Europe. Bergen was an example that Voy gave us because that's somewhere they operate. And there was lots of different types of approaches to parking infrastructure. We developed our own approach from reviewing others what we thought would work best, and we came up with the solution I mentioned earlier with a painted bay with bollards for quieter locations and a painted bay with corrals for busier locations. We set out an implementation timeline, and we do this for footway parking as well. Like I said, it's such a lengthy process that having that sort of kind of project plan for each consultation really helps to determine when you've got to meet each key milestone. And I'd say for new areas launching schemes, that's particularly important for when you're launching because you need to get all the approvals done in time for your launch date. You also have to apply to the DFT for road marking authorization. That takes about 8 weeks. Like I said, we developed the risk assessment checklist, and we started with a small scale trial of carriageway bays of about 10 sites so that we could monitor and then ensure we had a robust process before we expanded out to doing larger batches of consultations. But we actually found that monitoring was so useful. So in that first consultation of 10 sites, there was one site that had some issues, and we noticed it through the monitoring, and we were able to make some changes, and now that site is working really well. And so now for all carriageway parking, we for every new carriageway bay, we monitor the site for 3 months. We look at the parking compliance, the percentage of vehicles that are toppled. We get feedback from residents and the operator, and that's been really useful. And to date, no carriageway bays that have been installed have had to subsequently be uninstalled. So they've all remained in place. So yeah, that was quite a lot. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks for your time. I'll pass back over to Charlie.
Thank you, Brock. Yeah, that was fantastic. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, and we are moving to the Q&A section of the session now. So I will allow people to turn on their mics if they want to do that, turn on their cameras as well, so that you can ask questions verbally if you'd like to. Just use the raise hand feature, and we can make that possible. But yes, any questions, please do put them in the chat or ask them here in person. I mean, I'll kick us off. I had a question, Brock, about the transition away from one operator or from the two operators to a single operator. But I imagine that there's only a few instances out there in the UK where people have either swapped operators in the midst of a trial. Is there any? What were the kind of biggest challenges of that process in the Solent?
I think whilst we had two operators, it was quite challenging because we were basically trying to find space for parking, like for two different operators. So everywhere we were looking for parking, we were looking for parking for Barrow and for Voy. When we were trying to engage a private landowner to install a bay on their site, we weren't just trying to convince them to let one operator put a bay there, we were trying to convince them to put two there. So that was quite challenging, but I'd say all of that kind of hard work really paid off because we were able to work with two operators, see what worked, what does that operator do well, what does that operator do well, and we learned a lot. And then when we entered the procurement, we were able to then to kind of design or make the requirements in the specification for what we felt at that point was like the perfect scheme. And so that was really helpful. And then also when Voy was successful and they launched, because then they took over all of Barrel's old parking. It wasn't like all of that parking expansion for two operators had been for nothing. It's like all that hard work still paid off because then overnight, like Voy's parking increased by like 30%. And yeah, Voy therefore in Southampton. So Voy went from having 200 bays to 300 bays. Whereas before it was like Voy with 200, Barrel with 100. It just wasn't kind of as much of a seamless coordinated network for users trying to use micromobility. And then overnight, they just got so much more choice of vehicles and parking bays all within one app.
Mentioned a moment there about the specification for a perfect scheme. That almost sounds too good to be true. Were there anything that went into the specification for the second round of procurement that were as a result of learnings from the first time round? I'm aware there's people on the call from Brighton, for example, who are looking at an e-scooter scheme potentially for their city.
Yeah, so I think, well, one thing that went into it was that one thing that Barrel were really good at was like their site selection and their kind of data management over their parking bays. And we really liked the way they did that. So that kind of, I spoke about the parking log earlier, and like Barrel's approach to parking or data management of parking led to us developing the parking log. And in the specification, we kind of set out this is how parking site selection and management, this is how we want it to happen, and this is how you have to do it. And um, I guess for Voy, it's like a slightly different approach to how they might do it in other markets, but we find it works really well for us.
Thank you. We've got another question that's appeared in the chat. So this one's from first one in here from Ian asks, are Voy responsible for the rebalancing of scooters and bikes across the city to attempt to restore the aim of 1/3 bay availability, or is it contracted out? And how successful is that process?
So again, it's different in each area. So in Portsmouth, Voy is all down to Voy. Voy doesn't have a contractor in Portsmouth; they do it themselves. In Southampton, which is a slightly bigger scheme than Portsmouth, so in Portsmouth there's 200 bays, whereas in Southampton there's 300 bays, and therefore more vehicles. In Southampton, Voy does recruit third-party contractor to support them with the rebalancing, and on the Isle of Wight they have a third-party contractor that does all of it. So just like they approach the parking models, it's slightly different in each area.
I imagine Ian would have a question about, is there a preference from a local authority point of view about how that's managed?
I think I mean, so Voy has a warehouse in Fareham, which they manage the whole scheme from. Previously, Barrel opted for the different approach where they only use subcontractors in each area. And I would say, yeah, I think the approach that Voy has does work better. It kind of um it kind of places the responsibility more on them and gives them more ownership of it, and they have to kind of develop tools and tasks to manage it effectively themselves, which, so yeah, I'd say that was kind of has been what's worked better.
Thank you. We've got another question from Callie Sparks, who says, will the Southampton scheme be commercial by the end of the subsidy period? And how will the council manage parking sites if other operators that wish to offer a service in the Southampton area?
So currently, yeah, Voy has a contract with Southampton City Council, and due to the sole operator procurement, the council only wants one operator, and that contract is with Voy. We've seen in other areas like London. So for e-scooters through the trial are more regulated, and so it's impossible for another scooter operator to come and start a scheme in Southampton. But as we've seen in like London and Oxford, for bike share, it's less regulated, and we've seen instances where operators, Lime for example in Oxford, just kind of started a scheme overnight and don't have a contract with the local authority. So that could happen in Southampton and Portsmouth, but I think it's not quite the same as London and Oxford. And I think it's quite clear that it's kind of big enough for one operator, but the Department for Transport are introducing like a micromobility licensing framework through the devolution bill. So in the future, operators will have to get a license from the local authority to be able to operate. And so therefore, I think, in the future, it will be entirely down to the local authority how many operators are operating. And clearly in Southampton, it shows that the optimum level is one operator, and the scheme is now commercially viable in Southampton.
Thank you, Brock. Another question from Ian Saunders. He says, what was the starting point of identifying potential parking sites from a clean slate in an attempt to set out parking density? How is this then rolled out further to expand the scheme?
Sure. So I'll answer that question from the perspective of bike share, because when the e-scooter trail started in Southampton and Portsmouth, I was not in my post yet. So we started with like a city centre launch, which lasted 6 months. So there were around like 30 bays in the city centre. And then we expanded to go citywide. And the reason for that is that, yeah, it helped us to, if there are any kind of issues at the beginning, we could iron them out in a much smaller area and kind of see how everything went. In terms of the process, so like the operator goes out and selects a long list of sites. They use like a mixture of Google Street View and then site visits, and they go out with like measuring tape and they take a picture which shows the size of a bay. They do the risk assessment checklist. So they share with that and they put the information in the parking log. So they do a photo, risk assessment checklist, all the information in the parking log, send it all to us, and then we do initially a desktop review. If there are any sites that we have certain questions about or we need more information, we'll then go and do our own site visit, and then it kind of goes on through the approval process from there.
Thank you, Brock. There's no additional questions in the chat at the moment, but I had a follow-up question about the carriageway parking, which seems like a really critical next step for the schemes across the Solent. Are there any themes emerging about where you're more likely to get carriageway parking approved? I imagine, for example, the proximity to student accommodation might make that easier because there's potentially less cars or more of a desire for that kind of mobility option.
Yeah, so in Southampton, we're currently doing a consultation of carriageway parking, which is like focusing on the east side of the city, so beyond the river on the east, and that's because the parking density on that side of the city is, yeah, there's much less parking than the rest of the city, and it's typically like kind of some areas where there's like a 10-15 minute walk between bays, and so we really want to focus on that area. And the reason that we've really struggled to put footway parking in there is that, yeah, it's kind of lots of residential areas, but a lot of the footways are wide, but they have really big verges on them, and we need a hard standing to be able to install a rack, and we haven't got funding to go out and install hard standings everywhere, all over like grassy areas. So yeah, we've kind of been limited with how much we can expand footway parking there. But carriageway parking has then been a big opportunity to improve the parking density on the east side. So yeah, initially, yeah, it's kind of been, yeah, particularly residential areas where there's not so much footway space has been something that we have targeted, and I think we'll continue to target, to be honest. A lot of like student halls, so like the University of Southampton, for example, they have a private land agreement with Voy, and they have loads of parking bays like on their land. And so that's actually been quite easy to get the parking bays close to student halls of residence. It's been more, yeah, those kind of residential areas where there's not much footway space that has been a bit more challenging.
Yeah, we might come back with a follow-up question about private landholder sites, because I know that's been a key part of your strategy. But there's another great question in from Ian, who asks, does the parking data of the current scheme get taken into account to identify rollout sites to concentrate on areas where there is overparking or specific availability issues?
Yes, it does, and it's something that we've been able to do more recently. So when Voy proposes a list of sites, until now, like sometimes they'll propose a site that's quite like within a 2 or 1 minute walk from an existing bay, and so until now we would then go back to Voy and ask them to provide evidence of why that site is needed. So, and they would do that by 2 ways. They would give us the ridership data of that particular bay, and like the data on what proportion of time that bay is at its max cap. So to answer your question, yes, that is taken into account. But as the scheme's developed, we now have access to a platform called ViaNova, which basically just gives us like way more insight into the data and analytics of the scheme. So we're able to pull some of that stuff out ourselves and have a look ourselves. And Voy is also beginning to share more data with us around like the percentage of time that bays are at their max cap when they report to us monthly on the scheme through their monthly report. And yeah, they're including that in there. So to answer your question, like, yeah, we have, but as time's gone on, we've kind of done it in a more formal and more in-depth way so that we have access to more data, which is informing these kind of decisions.
Thank you, Brock. Ian, hopefully that answers your question. A follow-up question about the private landholders, Brock. I know you've obviously spoken about engaging with the universities. I know that you've also engaged with some of the NHS hospital sites about talking to them about micromobility parking. Have you got any tips or any recommendations for people who want to engage with some of these big private landholders who've got lots and lots of generating lots of trips to and from their sites? Have you got any tips about how to go about engaging them and getting parking onto their land?
Yeah, my tip would be to definitely, seek to do that. And we find that it works best when with a kind of two-pronged approach where you work with the operator to engage that private landowner to make the case to them that the bay should be installed on their land. So yeah, work together with the operator. However, its success really varies on the landowner. So like I mentioned, in Southampton, we've had the success with the universities, but in Portsmouth, the University of Portsmouth has a policy where they didn't want new private licenses with third parties for area on their land. So we were actually not able to install any bays on private land at Portsmouth University. Whereas for the NHS, which you mentioned, it's the flip side. QA Hospital in Portsmouth has a sustainability manager who's like a big advocate and user of the scheme, and we've been able to get void parking in there. Whereas the Southampton General Hospital, the clinicians are not so supportive of e-scooters, and we've been unable to get parking in there. So I guess my main recommendation would be, yeah, try and unlock doors to install private parking bays, because there's they're generally at key trip generators. They're really important for the scheme, but don't rely on that. It's kind of like you need to focus on expanding the network on the public highway, all of the land that the council owns and manages, that you have more influence over, and you can make a greater impact of installing more bays, and then try and target private bays to kind of top that up.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful advice. We know from our data that a lot of the ridership for micromobility tends to be of a certain age and stage of life, and students are particularly highly represented within that group. So I imagine there'll be lots of people who are hoping to have conversations with their local universities and further education colleges. Are there any other questions that I haven't got any further questions in the chat, but would anybody like to ask a question in person? Use their voice. Otherwise, we'll think about bringing our session to an end. Silence is deafening. Well, thank you everybody for coming along. We will be having another lunch and learn session next week.